Okay, well, welcome everybody. I want to start with today's call. We're going to really look at two different things. The first thing I want to do is kind of give you an update on the AP exam itself, what the changes were announced last week on what the exam will look like. And then the other thing that we're going to get into today is we're going to talk cultural and social movements post World War II. And then we're going to back up and we're going to talk about some of the larger ones throughout American history. And after this call today, or towards the end of the call today, I'm going to talk to you guys about what the next few steps will look like, what Thursday will look like, and the following weeks. I put up a schedule. I don't know if you guys got to see that yet, but I want to take you through that on what the plan is for the next few weeks, kind of how we'll do this study together. So first what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen with you and take you through what changes were made to the exam. Let me back this up. So this is the agenda I sent out. I hope you guys were able to see this on the call for today. And I'm just going to start doing this every time where you guys have the opportunity to take a look at what's going on here and what we're going to be talking about, and have those discussion questions available for you as well. So the first thing here is I wanted to talk to you about the changes to the AP exam. We've got the link here to the College Board page for students, and it takes you through the time of the exam. I put up I tweeted out some of this information as it became available to us. So you guys are going to be on May 15th, Friday. But the biggest news is, so they pushed it back slightly, but the biggest news is really what that exam is going to look like. Okay, so remember, we were in a position where the exam was going to be, the different parts. You had the long essay, the DBQ, short answers, multiple choice. Well, now what's going to happen is it's 45-minute exam, and you're going to have one DBQ question, okay, document-based question. Instead of giving you 7 sources, they're going to give you 5 sources. You're going to analyze those 5 sources. You're going to produce a historical argument. And that's going to be it. That's going to be all it is. So you got 45 minutes to do that. You will be scored only on the basis of that exam. It's recalibrated so that will be reflective of your entire course, your entire year. So just to tell you what that means to me, again, I'm getting on a call with them later this week, but they're going to ask you you're going to deal with, maybe civil rights over decades, or you're going to deal with foreign policy over decades. You're going to deal with economic policy over decades. I mean, they're not going to ask you something really minute like this year or this 2 or 3 year period. They're going to give you some documents over a longer length of time, and you're going to develop a thesis based on that and write an essay in 45 minutes. So that's it. That's what we have to work with. So next week, again, I'm going to share my screen back with you and kind of go to the agenda I sent out at the bottom of the agenda. So I have the discussion questions here for you. At the bottom, I linked to some videos. I'm going to try to continue doing that so that, not just my videos, but again, these crash course videos are really well done. So you can watch those and any other recommendations. But also I have attached here the schedule for the rest of the year. So really what we're going to do is we're going to continue to do looking over social and cultural movements post-World War II on Thursday. But then next week, we're going to continue the high-level review over materials, but we're going to start doing that using documents. And I'm going to start talking to you more specifically on how to analyze primary and secondary sources so that you're prepared for that exam. And then the following week, we're going to do some DBQs together so that, again, you feel comfortable with that. You feel like we've done it recently. And the scoring is basically the same. They've just recalibrated it, but it'll really be the same key points they're looking for. So that's the latest on the AP exam, again, on May 15th. And it'll be one DBQ that will be done in a 45-minute period with 5 documents. Are there any questions over that at this point in time before we get into the content that we're going to review today? And again, there's been some questions out there, and so the college board is going to get back on a call this week, and so I'm going to listen in on that and just see if there's any changes. But right now, that's the high level view of it. And again, I like it. I think it's, considering the circumstances, it's pretty fair, and I think you guys will be ready for it. So I'm going to keep you'll hear me talk more about that here in the future as we continue to go on. So I want to go ahead and dig into the discussion questions and start talking about the civil rights movement and what we need to be kind of remembering from a high level view. So the first thing is, let me pull back over here to the first discussion question. So the first discussion question I wanted you to notice is, in the 1950s, we have this growth of the suburbs. So there's a few questions there about the growth of the suburbs. So one of the things that I want you to remember is, coming out of World War II, you have everybody that comes home, and you have what they call the baby boom era, right? You have people that come home from World War II that are not expecting to make it home. And now they are home, and now they're married, and now they want to have kids, and now they want to have the white picket fence, and they want to have a dog, and they want this kind of perfect family life. And the 50s is very much this explosion of children that are born, and this explosion of home buyers. Now, some of the interesting aspects of like the home buyers are that a lot of architects and manufacturers decide to make homes smaller in kind of this cookie cutter fashion. And the benefit of making all homes, and if you've been up here, I mean, I live in North Oklahoma City now, you can drive by and every house like looks the same. If you've ever been in neighborhoods like that, close to big cities where like every house looks almost identical, it's really cheap to do that. Like, it's the same floor plan. You just do it again and again. Even in McAllister and some places that maybe aren't by a really big city, you'll see that. Like, there will be certain developments where all the homes look the same. Well, it's cheaper to do that. And so we see that a lot in the 1950s, where people, their houses aren't as big, they're smaller, but you have this little piece of land and it's yours. And a lot of people now can afford that, coming back from World War II. But inside of that, we have this development of, and again, getting into the social issue of women's rights and the role of women in society. One of the interesting things that happens in World War II is, while the men are off to war, the women step and fulfill the traditional men's role in society, which is like working in factories, working in these larger businesses, right? Well, now what we see is, when the men return home, what happens?
They want their jobs back.
They want their jobs back. Okay, so what ends up occurring is the men end up replacing the women in the factory setting, and the women go back to fulfilling that household role. And if you're familiar, and you guys covered this slightly before World War II, but there was something called the cult of domesticity. And that was the belief that women worked in the home, women did the household chores, women, it was looked down upon to work out of the home, to be ambitious with a career. Okay, it was just kind of, they call it a cult because it was just kind of a belief of the day. It was kind of reflected in literature of the time. Just most people assumed that that was the role of women. Well, we're about to challenge that in the early 60s. Okay, there's going to be a pushback on that we're going to get into in a minute. But I do want you to remember that the 50s are this time of, we're back, we won World War II, it's an exciting time to grow a family and move forward. But there is an issue, right? Because when we talked about the Cold War dynamic, I wanted to show you guys this because I think this always does a great job of explaining it. What this is a diagram of all the nuclear bombs set off in the world, okay? So we're gonna start with some testing early on, okay? Okay, so let me let it back up. So no, we have a few bombs that have been set off. We have some tests run. We have a couple dropped on. Can you see that at the top of my screen? I'm going to fast forward to when we get to the 50s. So we have nuclear testing that's going on in 1946. You're going to see why I wanted to show you this map here in a second. As we move on in time and the Russians begin testing and the Americans start testing, every one of these little lights that go off is a nuclear test. As nuclear testing, I'm just going to let this play as I'm talking here, as nuclear testing begins to occur more and more, what we have are more and more scientists that are saying every time you blow one of these nuclear bombs up, you're letting all this radiation in the air. And we don't know how it's going to affect society. And as time goes on, and as we see the Russians growing more and more nuclear weapons, testing more and more nuclear weapons, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we have the hydrogen bomb, which is even exponentially more lethal and more megatons than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People really begin to have this fear of what happens if we enter another war. So again, notice we're getting here to the end of the 50s. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead to look at the 60s. And look at all of these nuclear bombs that we're setting off, that we're testing out here in New Mexico and Arizona. Look at the ones we're testing out in the ocean. Look at the Russians testing as well. And you see that now the Russians and the United States, we're testing in the hundreds of nuclear weapons a year. And again, scientists are very concerned with the effects on the atmosphere. And so you begin to have this worry going into the 1960s about the environment, about are we doing things that are causing detriment to the environment at large. So that begins to be an issue as well. So while things seem really, really good, as we have families coming together, as we have this really happy mindset of the 50s where we're not at war anymore and things have calmed down. In the 60s, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis and nuclear weapons. That begins to push that to go to a place of concern for a lot of Americans. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is kind of shifting focus to another movement going on at the time is the civil rights movement. And again, you're going to see this reach its apex here in Little Rock. So what we see here is a situation where in 1954, we had the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. And the Supreme Court said, when you segregate, that is unconstitutional, that doing that is unequal. If you guys remember the court case that said segregation was legal, you remember what court case that was? Plessy versus Ferguson. You need to make sure that you remember of the civil rights cases, Dred Scott versus Sanford, okay, 1857, that said slavery was legal. 1898, Plessy versus Ferguson said segregation was legal. But then in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education said segregation is illegal. You cannot segregate someone based on their race. By the way, there's this amazing moment where an attorney comes in and calls onto the stand a psychologist. And the psychologist talks about, I can show you how much damage is done to children based on segregation in schools. And what they do is they show that usually when you're like 5 and 6 years old, what you do is you like dolls, like Barbie dolls and stuff that look like you. They say that's just part of social development. And they brought in some studies that showed that even young black kids in segregated schools wanted the white dolls. And when they asked them why, they said, well, because they're better. Because they're better. And what the psychologist said is, look, because we segregated them for so long and we put all the black students in the bad school and the white students in the good school, these young black kids are going, well, I guess white's better, like at 5 and 6. And so the psychologist went on and talked about how detrimental that was. So it's a fascinating case. But once they say that you can't segregate schools anymore, guess what that means? It's time to take white students and put them in what was the black school. And the much more dangerous one, it's time to take black students and move them into the white school. So what happened in Little Rock was the governor said he wasn't going to allow this to happen. He didn't want black students in the white schools. And then Dwight Eisenhower, their president of the United States, says, actually, the black students are going to go to school there. And I'm going to send in the National Guard, and I'm going to deputize the 101st Airborne and send them in as bodyguards for these students. So incredibly, if you remember the 101st Airborne, these were the guys that in World War II got dropped behind enemy lines on D-Day and fought their way back. So we're talking like not just any kind of military guys. These guys are like the toughest of the tough. And so they escorted the black students into Little Rock High School, which, by the way, if you look behind, Coach Hampton was up here earlier. He had a picture of the school there behind him. But anyway, look at the protest. The girls, there were 3 little girls here that were spit on and had stuff thrown on them. But now in Little Rock, which some of you know, I went to college in Arkansas. There are these tremendous monuments are built. There's one of the young ladies there that was built to the Little Rock Nine, the 9 kids that entered the white school. And this was the beginning of segregation really in the South. And so it's just an incredible moment. But you see, post-World War II, the confrontations on civil rights are really going to heat up. And, you know, obviously, if you look behind me here, I've got one of the most influential civil rights leaders, honestly, social movement leaders in the history of the world, Martin Luther King Jr. And I want to talk about him briefly. I want to kind of talk about the African-American civil rights movement and the split in it. Okay. So first of all, Martin Luther King Jr. is here. This is his famous DC speech, "I Have a Dream." Unbelievable, unbelievable speech. I might show you a clip of it here in a second. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is Martin Luther King is incredibly unique because of his background as a preacher. Okay, he was a Baptist preacher, had a doctorate in theology. Because of that, he really lifts the argument. Okay, African Americans in America wanted equal rights way before Martin Luther King. Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit too towards the end of this class. But one of the things that he did that was so effective is if you look in the, I know you can't see it obviously from this picture here, but when you look at some other pictures, there's a lot of black leaders. There's a lot of white people there too. He had the ability to make the Christian argument that it's not right, it's not morally right, it's not right in the eyes of God to treat people differently based on the color of their skin. He does it so effectively that he really galvanizes the movement. And there were a lot of white people before that thought this was wrong, but Martin Luther King Jr. really was such a powerful speaker that he mobilized them to go out and fight for this as well. So brought the black community together to fight for their rights. And by the way, incredibly peaceful man. He was actually a pacifist. He was anti-war, was anti-violence, talked about if they do these things to you, when they spray you with a water hose. By the way, when you see those videos spraying with a water hose, you got to remember how hard that water pressure is. So when you see them out doing that to people, a lot of times it broke the skin, it bruised. I mean, this was, when you saw that on TV, it was just terrible. That was done to protesters. But one of the things that Martin Luther King talked about was, you know, when you really started to see more and more support growing to African Americans in the civil rights movement, when those events were televised, when people saw how bad they were treated, when people saw the way these governors were sending police dogs out after them for simply protesting, this really turned the tide in the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King, it is hard to overstate his impact. And I will say this is like a personal plug. And by the way, if you take AP Government next year, one of the only primary source documents you have to know, the only one that's out of the founding era, is his letter from a Birmingham jail. When he gets arrested, a lot of Baptist preachers write a letter against him saying what he did was wrong, he should obey the law. He writes this unbelievable letter and says, but what if the law is immoral? If the law is immoral, should I follow it? As a Christian, what should I follow? He goes back to Daniel in the Bible. He quotes Aristotle. I mean, he does this. It's just, you know, it's just a letter, but this letter is like this incredible argument about what if the government's wrong? You know, what if they do something so terrible that it's immoral? Do you have to obey what they say? It's a fascinating letter. Like I said, you'll deal with it more next year in AP Government, but I want to talk, and that again shows his skill as a thinker in putting these things together. So, but he was not the only civil rights leader of significance. You have another man named Malcolm X. Okay. Now, Malcolm X believed the civil rights movement should look a lot different because Martin Luther King was very nonviolent. He believed that you really should not, you should not have any kind of ill will towards your oppressors, that's part of what separates you and makes you different. That when you do these things, and I'll just kind of let this run here in the background here, but when you do these things, when you stand up for what's right and people are violent to you, it only makes you look better. And he drew on Gandhi. If you remember from world history, Gandhi did this very successfully. But Martin Luther King believed that this would only strengthen their cause. Well, Malcolm X is very much the opposite. Malcolm X believed you needed to force change now. That waiting is only making it worse. That you've got to be, if they're going to be violent to you, you be violent to them. That if they're going to be scared to do things, to change things for African Americans because they're scared of, kind of like, that racists will like push back and get mad. Well, you need to be madder. And so he started the Black Panthers, which started pushing a violent response to government oppression. So you have these two people, two very different approaches. By the way, you've already covered two civil rights leaders with two different approaches. Do you remember who they were? Remember Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois? W.E.B. Du Bois said, we want equal rights now, right now. And then you had Booker T. Washington who said, what if we just like take it a step at a time? We want these rights, then over time we'll ask for these rights and so forth and so on. So this is, honestly, guys, this is an age-old kind of argument. You hear this a lot today, right? If you think that things need to change, do you change them in a big way, really fast, or do you try to be more incremental? And do the ends justify the means? If you're going to accomplish something good, is it okay to be violent? Think about the old slave revolts. Think about Nat Turner. Remember, Nat Turner goes and kills a slave owner and says, hey, if I got to kill them all to free the slaves, I guess that's what I'm going to do. But then you had other people like Frederick Douglass who goes, no, don't be violent. Make the argument, right? Be better than them. So this is going on throughout history, especially throughout American history, is a struggle with how do you create change? How do you do this? What's the appropriate way to institute that? So I think that that's something that we want to be sure that we notice is those differences between those individuals. So talked Little Rock, the crisis at Little Rock. We talked a little bit about desegregating the South, because just because you have a movement that says that they want, or a Supreme Court ruling that says segregation is illegal, you still have states that are dragging their feet to do it. And by the way, it's very difficult to do that, right? I mean, you can say, all right, we're going to desegregate and we're going to take these black students, we're going to put them in the white school. Does that necessarily mean the white school is going to treat them right? Not necessarily, right? Depends on the school leaders and whatnot. So all of these struggles continue. In 68, we see the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Then in 69, we see the assassination of Malcolm X. And so again, you have these civil rights leaders that have this major movement, and then they're assassinated, and then it makes Martin Luther King Jr. really a martyr. I mean, now you look back and you go, so they killed someone that didn't believe in violence. Like, again, it is fascinating that Gandhi got killed as well. It's sometimes interesting to see people that are most anti-violent sometimes have met really violent deaths. It's just something that we've seen throughout history that occurs from time to time, especially comparing those two is always a fascinating exercise as well. We see the civil rights acts of 64, 68 continue to advance the legal rights there of African Americans throughout this time. Now I'm gonna do a quick shift towards women's rights and some other groups' civil rights, and then I want to back up and do some more of a thematic study. Is there any feedback there? I'm sorry, I'm trying to look through and make sure I'm not missing any comments or anything like that, but is there any question here before I move to women's rights in the 60s and 70s? All right, well, let's just jump right in. So we've got here this lady. I don't know if you've probably seen her before, but Betty Friedman runs an organization or writes a book called The Feminine Mystique. And the feminine mystique was that, I'm just going to try to make this bigger. The feminine mystique showed that she believed that women were unique individuals that had aspirations that were outside the home, that potentially could be more of a sexual identity that they haven't been allowed to have. If there was a woman before her named Margaret Sanger, who was a huge abortion advocate, who pushed that should be a woman's right to choose. Betty Friedman kind of goes along with that, but it's not as, she has a sexual argument there that women should have a sexual identity and not be looked down upon it, but hers is broader than that we're saying that women have to be in a home, but women might not want to be in a home, and that they might want to pursue their jobs, and that women should have the ability to do that, that women should have an equal rights amendment. You're going to see this mentioned a lot in the 70s. As a matter of fact, it still comes up from time to time right now. There was a push just a couple years ago for an equal rights amendment for women. But we just haven't seen that come to fruition. But the book is called the Feminine Mystique, and it's a pushback on the cult of domesticity, that it is women should be viewed as people with unique individual pursuits, particularly in the workforce, that they should not be blocked out of the workforce, that they should not be assumed to only have, I mean, back then, your book talks about in American Pageant, it describes that there's really those three major professions that women were viewed to have, and that was teaching, secretarial work, and nursing. And you still, I mean, you still see studies today that show, I mean, those are still professions that have a large percentage of women workers, but now, of course, you see it growing in many other fields, right? I mean, now you're starting to see the college admissions. One of the things that have been focused on lately is like the sciences. We see less women that are involved in some of the science degrees, but again, we see the trajectory is up. But and this goes back to the 70s, is trying to affect these things. So that was the women's rights movement. And again, I'm going to kind of come back to that as we talk here in a second as a review further back beyond that. But the Equals Rights Amendment did not pass in the 70s. It got very close in 72. Interestingly, again, I'm not trying to like kick off like a political firestorm with this, but it is interesting the reason why it did not pass in the 70s. There was some women's groups, Phyllis Schlafly is the main instigator kind of in the pushback. There were some women's groups that were worried that if there was an equal rights amendment, first of all, they made a minor issue. This is the one I thought might be kind of controversial, but there was a minimal issue that they said, well, first of all, if you can't distinguish based on gender, what about women's bathrooms and women's dressing rooms? Would that be considered a violation of the Equal Rights Amendment? So it's kind of fascinating. That was kind of discussed in the 70s, and now we're addressing that topic today from a different angle. But that was something they actually were concerned about. They said, well, that's technically speaking, right? That's applying a different standard or setting a rule based upon gender. That was the minor one. The biggest one was, if we do this, could we still distinguish between men and women in a draft? So like next time there's a war, which remember, we're talking, it's the 60s and 70s, so Vietnam is going on and there is a draft. If we have another draft, would we have to draft 50% women? That was a major concern from some women's groups. So they didn't necessarily want a constitutional amendment. But like I said, that constitutional amendment comes up a lot, but we have never had the amount of states to ratify that amendment. So I think at one point the closest they got within 4 or 5 states back in the 70s. I don't think we've ever gotten closer than that, if my memory is correct. The other groups, and guys, by the way, obviously there are other groups that are pushing for their rights here too, right? So we have Mexican Americans that are living in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, that there are battles going on their forefront throughout this time as well. You see that a lot with the Chicanos in the 1960s, that movement. You also see, and so you have the Hispanic Americans, so those are the Americans that are mainly coming from the Mexico region. But then you also have the Latin American movement that is more of, we're talking about some of the Latin American countries. We're talking about like Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, Cuba. So you also have that, which again are very different people groups. I mean, they're very different in their culture. And so you have these movements. A lot of times the Hispanic movement really comes into friction with the California government. So your book focuses in the 60s of a lot of that. So one of the movements that really attaches themselves to this push for rights, we also have gay rights. It begins to be very popular in the late 60s, early 70s. Again, it's mainly in LA, San Francisco. These are kind of the hubs for it, but there are protests around the country for it as well. but we really see it focused there. And there's a bigger movement that we call the countercultural movement, kind of the hippies, right? This is Woodstock. This is these group of people that are challenging society that occur in the 60s. And so one of the things I want to point out is notice this pendulum swing that goes on in America about societal norms. What I say about 1950s, the goal was this, get married, have a few kids, have a white picket fence, have a dog, go to work every day, kind of this very established cultural lifestyle. In the 60s, we see this group, the countercultural movement, that really pushes back on that. Well, who says that we need to be married young? Who says that we need to be married at all? Who says that women need to work in the home? Who says that we should have to work? Why should we have to have a job? Why can't we have a job when we get a lot older? Why do we get paid as little as we do? We got to work for 20 years to make more money. This is really a movement that, again, I think countercultural is the best description, which is just they're pushing back on the culture that was developed in the 50s. On a side note, really the thing that really pushes them as being viewed as extremist is the Charlie Manson murders. If you haven't read up on those are fascinating. But Charlie Manson is able to convince several of these people that I would say would fall into the countercultural, that's how people would view him, to go and kill a famous movie star. And a terrible, brutal murder. And then as time goes on, you see that there were just a lot of these young people that were living out in California that didn't have jobs, that were kind of protesting, but then kind of wandering around aimlessly. And he found some vulnerable ones and convinced them to go and commit several murders. And so it really kind of attached, people viewed the countercultural movement as, well, what's going on? Like, what's the end game here? Like, what are these young people going to do? Like, they're just kind of wandering aimlessly. And then you have the election of 1968, where Richard Nixon, who's like the most anti-countercultural person ever, even a lot of more establishment politicians didn't even like Nixon because he was so kind of establishment-y. So he's like the complete other end of the spectrum. And he would go out and argue with the protesters and the countercultural students all the time. And so you're going to see a lot of friction there as well. So that's kind of the broader view of that countercultural movement of that time. So let me get back and check the discussion questions, as I've just kind of given you guys a really high overview of it. I can kind of get down and make sure that I've addressed all those things in there. Are there any questions at this point? So I know we're just moving super quick. Okay, one of the things I want to point out to you guys at this point also is, and I put those highlighted there because question number 6, there's some diplomatic questions there, economic bullet points. I'm not concerned about that as much as I was the feminist and civil rights arguments that were going on in the 60s and 70s. And the last question I asked you guys, I highlighted because I think that's really where I want to end this class today and really spend some time on it. What were the most influential social movements in American history? Can you, I'd like to kind of get some feedback from you guys on that. Can you give me, what were some of the most influential social movements? Of course, I touched on the ones post-World War II, but can you give me some that were before that? What do you remember being these really influential movements? Let's go back to the beginning. I'll pose it as a question. Was the revolutionary spirit, the individuals pushing back on British rule, what was their reason for that? Was that social? Was that economic? Was that religious? Could you make an argument that there was some social aspect of it? I want you to think, did they want to be British? They didn't. They had a unique culture at that time. They wanted much more independence than Great Britain gave them. I want you to remember that, I mean, I tried to kind of cover this when I had most of you for world history, which is, guys, there's another side of the revolution that's taught from the British school of thought, which is, hey, the Americans were way out of line. Hey, the Americans, we charged them less taxes than we did our citizens that lived here. We gave them protection. We let them have some say in our government. Now, it wasn't a lot of say, but they did get to come and observe and make comments, blah, blah, blah. And so they kind of have this perspective on it. But again, as being a unique American culture, these are people that risk their lives for religious, economic purposes to come to America, to be able to worship as they wanted, also to be able to make a living for themselves, to risk. I mean, at that point in time, someone would have probably told you had a better 50% chance of dying within a year of coming over to America in the early colony days of 1600s. These people risked all that. They went into all this territory, they made a living for themselves, and they did all this, and they did not take kindly to people telling them, well, we'll kind of make these decisions for you. We'll let you come in and listen, but you can't vote. You can just talk. And no, that was not the American culture of the day. The American culture is one of rugged individualism, of independence. And so you see it going all the way back to these early colonial days, that was absolutely, you can make the argument that there is a social movement to that as well, that they wanted independence. It wasn't just, it was in a large degree political, but again, there's this unique culture. If you remember, I had you guys look at Alexis de Tocqueville, who's this Frenchman who comes over to America and goes, this is different. Like, this isn't like Europe. Like, this is a different group of people. They're very unique. And that's important to remember, that America has a unique social individualism that they push for. I'm going to kind of take us through time. Then we have the abolitionist movement. Okay, so this is your very earliest civil rights movement that ends slavery, kind of the original civil rights movement here. And remember, again, as I addressed earlier, you had people who thought, hey, John Brown was a hero. He killed slave owners. That was appropriate because they weren't freeing the slaves. And you had other people, again, like Frederick Douglass, who said, listen, we can make the argument that it's immoral, that it's wrong, that it's bad policy to do this, and that can win the day. Of course, it takes decades before that's tragically settled with a civil war, but that's ultimately what it was required. One of the things that is important is, again, the story of, there's a great biography on Frederick Douglass that came out just a couple years ago that I highly recommend. But Frederick Douglass is a figure that used the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How do you miss the second one? How do you say that because I'm black, I should be a slave? And Abraham Lincoln and him have these discussions, and they make that same argument together. And it comes up from a lot of their discussions together that, listen, yes, some of the founders owned slaves, but the founders put certain things in here that you can use to make this argument that slavery should go away. And the Declaration of Independence is often cited by Frederick Douglass as a reason for that our government was set up to not have slavery. So he makes that argument. Progressivism. Remember progressivism, and there's a famous book that was written at the time that was How the Other Half Lives. And there were people like Jacob Riis who took pictures of people in society at that point in time and how bad society was and how dirty the streets were. And I remember I showed you guys these pictures in the late 1800s and said, hey, here's the streets. And by the way, that's not like mud. That's like people using the bathroom right there on the street, and your kids are out playing in it. I mean, it was just so nasty, so dirty. You had all of the kind of the underbelly of the large cities, all the crime and all this that went on. The progressive era was society should look a lot different. And that means that government should be more proactive in cleaning those things up. So we see the progressive era is very much a social cultural movement, as well as it is a political movement. Similar, women's suffrage. Again, you've covered this, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes the Declaration of Sentiments that is this call for women to have equal rights. And you can tell from the title, the Declaration of Sentiments. I mean, it is a play on the Declaration of Independence. It is absolutely a call that there are certain rights that should be universal, that everyone knows to be true, and that should extend to women. You see that case made, again, that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the one that gives that document there for the women's suffrage movement. And so one of the things that I want to point out with all of that is, and I'm sure that you notice that there are some themes that occur that we see that repeat themselves. And that is, for one, we often have people who run these social movements that often play back on our history, because in America, that's been very effective over time. And I'm sure that you've seen people do and make similar arguments, which is, hey, look, it says in the Declaration of Independence that we should have liberty. And again, look at all these movements that use the Declaration of Independence. It's very powerful. You have a lot of people that point back to the Constitution and say, listen, I thought that this country was set up to be this way. Well, that has proven over time to be very powerful in these movements. I also want to point out something else. I tried to give you guys the names of those leaders and some of the things they did, because oftentimes in movements, the leader is incredibly important, incredibly important. If they can really articulate their messaging well, if they can make the case, if they can make an appeal to you on a personal level. I want you guys to go back to the Civil War and think about what Lincoln says to Harriet Beecher Stowe, that you're the young lady that started this war. Again, what did she do? She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. What was important about Uncle Tom's Cabin? I told you, it wasn't that they were surprised that there was slavery. It was that reading that story appealed to them because they identified with them. I want you guys to think about it. If you've seen this, if you've ever seen anything going on in the world, and actually, I'll use this as an example. Whenever we're about to go into another presidential election this fall. Presidential candidates will always do this. Well, I met Susie when I was in Indiana. And, Susie was working at a farmer's market. You know what Susie told me? She told me that when I cut her taxes, it gave her the ability to go out and afford to grow new crops, whatever the story is, right? Why do they always give you a story about like Susie or John? Or why do they always do that?
Coach, you remember Joe the plumber?
Joe the plumber.
Talked about Joe the plumber.
Yeah, absolutely. You see this like every go-round, guys, and the reason they do that is it's a very effective tool that if you can get somebody to identify with an individual, then you really win them over. And so that's a very important, it's a very powerful way to impact society at large. And so you see that with Martin Luther King, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you see it back with Frederick Douglass, you see it with all these figures that do an amazing job of connecting people with the plight of the ones they're trying to help. That's why those photographers, those muckrakers, Jacob Riis, all those into Dorothy Lang in the progressive era were important, because they showed you the stories of those poor people in the big cities. Again, it's just a very powerful tool, and you see the leaders of these movements can do a very effective job at that, and that helps mobilize people. I mean, again, Martin Luther King Jr. was not the first person that said African Americans needed civil rights, but he was one of the more powerful ones. Okay, then you see people like Rosa Parks that just have this very heroic moment that they really galvanize the public because of this one show of courage. You see that throughout history as well, and you see it specifically in American history. So yeah, those are some things that we see that these movements have in common. One of the kind of more depressing things that these movements have in common is sometimes their leaders aren't always, they're not as well respected or honored in broad society, right? They have real enemies. I mean, there's people very angry at Martin Luther King Jr. for his speeches. There's people who are very angry at some of these individuals, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have tragic endings. And you can go back again in world history to Gandhi, Socrates. You have these people that are often killed tragically in early stages of their life because they kind of decided to stand for something, and we can remember them as heroes, and they have this great legacy. But it doesn't always mean their life will end well. As a matter of fact, to be perfectly honest with you, more often than not in history, it doesn't end well. I mean, look at Abraham Lincoln. I mean, a lot of times you tend to, when you're kind of a heroic figure, can have these tragic ends. And I don't mean they all get shot and killed. I mean, again, I know I reference him too much, but Winston Churchill gets voted out of being the prime minister after winning World War II. I mean, it's like he wins the war, and then they don't want him to be prime minister anymore. I mean, it's just, that happens. That's kind of another thing that I'd like to talk to you guys about at the end of the year is some of the larger themes in history that it seems, some of the lessons I think that we can learn from that, but we'll save that for another day. So a few things here, and again, I'm just going to glance around and make sure I haven't missed anything. Thank you. Good comment there, Billy, about social and economic being part of that as well. That again, I think I'm trying not to be overly simplistic with these movements to show you there's a lot at play here, right? That there's complexity to them. So Olivia asked, did I send out the page with the schedule? I did. I put it in the email to everyone and in the Zoom invite. I can resend an email, but like in the Zoom invite for this meeting, if you'll look in the notes of it, I put the link to these documents. But I can send out an email. I'm more than happy to do that. So I can do that, Olivia.
The last email I got was April 2nd.
Yeah,
Same
same
here.
Same here.
I didn't get an April 7th.
Okay. I'll send that again. My apologies. I might not have, maybe it's in my drafts there or something. But yeah, no, what I would like to do is every week, and I'll send it because it's got the stuff for later in the week too, is I want that to be sent where you guys have the week, what we're doing, what we're going to be talking about. And there are going to be links on there. So if you didn't see that beforehand, I will say I put a lot of crash course videos on there that, again, they're really good listen. Again, I used to listen to some of those YouTube videos and whatnot just on my phone, put my headphones in and be able to listen to those that are always a good review as well. Thank you for that feedback, Olivia. I'm glad you brought that to my attention. Is there anything else or any issues that you guys have had with any of that? And these are what those crash course videos look like there. But yeah, so I'll resend this. But so here was the schedule for today's call. So those discussion questions that I covered with you guys, and then here's the links to the crash course videos. My little Netflix suggestion there for the week, and then my website link, and then I have the schedule on here. But again, I'll attach this to the email as well. But again, if this is continuing to work with you all, and by the way, I sure do not mind jumping on a call if need be on a on a Wednesday, a 30-minute call or anything like that, or I mean, again, I can plug in an hour or so. But again, if there's a few of you that want something covered or have some questions, again, we can do a quick Zoom meeting. If you have a few questions for me, please feel free to reach out to me via email or on Twitter if you need that, guys. I mean, it's really, kind of like everybody else working from home, and I can definitely fit things in between meetings and whatnot. So just holler at me if you need anything like that. But holler at me if you need any resources or if you feel like something needs to be covered in greater detail. But again, we're going to do a further review over some of these movements, and we're going to do it in a little different way on Thursday. So I hope you guys can get on the call Thursday at 2. Next week, I'm assuming we'll just keep it at 2 unless I hear objections from you guys or unless I start getting emails saying, hey, there's another time that's better. But we're going to really dig into detail next week on how to analyze documents, primary and secondary sources, in particular for the exam, but just in general too. We're going to continue kind of our review by analyzing those documents. So yeah, and then you can kind of see the rest of the schedule there. But we've got the AP exam on the 15th. And so there will be one where we'll do a DBQ together. I'm kind of planning on that April 21st date there. But again, I'm very open to adjusting and adding more if necessary too. So you guys, please feel free to tell me that, okay? Yeah. Anything else? Do I have any other feedback? I'm trying to look through the picture of. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining the call, and we'll plan on doing this again on Thursday at 2 o'clock. And again, please make sure you hit me up if you guys have any questions between now and then. Again, I'd be more than happy if you have a specific question to cover it at the beginning of the class on Thursday, if you can shoot me a note, okay? Well, everybody, stay safe, stay healthy, and look forward to seeing you guys later in the week. See y'all.
Yeah.